Dennis Kincaid was having a pretty decent Tuesday, at least by his standards. The weather was tolerable, his coffee had just the right amount of creamer, and his boss had decided to direct his daily dose of condescending wisdom toward the intern instead of him. A rare win. At exactly 5:02 p.m., Dennis shut down his computer, grabbed his keys, and left work like a man escaping a burning building. He had mastered this exit over the years, head down, no eye contact, strategic weaving through the cubicles to avoid last-minute quick questions that were never quick. His only plan for the evening was to get home, crack open a beer, and maybe, if he was feeling ambitious, start that book Heather had been recommending for the past 6 months. Something about expanding his horizons. Because, apparently, his horizons weren't wide enough. Marriage, he had learned, was a series of these small, unsolicited improvement projects. Heather wasn't outright demanding he be a better man, but she was definitely making some polite suggestions. Try reading more, Dennis. Maybe switch up your wardrobe, Dennis. Have you ever considered journaling? I heard it helps men get in touch with their emotions. Dennis wasn't against self-improvement, but he figured he was doing just fine as he was. He paid his taxes, held a steady job, and had successfully kept a houseplant alive for 3 years. That had to count for something. He turned onto his street, noticing that Heather's car was already in the driveway. Odd. She usually worked late on Tuesdays, something about a big project at the office. Maybe she had finally listened to his advice and decided that working overtime for free wasn't a personality trait worth bragging about. Dennis parked, stepped out, and took a deep breath. Something smelled off. Not bad, exactly. Just out of place. Like a mix of paint and chemical cleaner. The kind of smell that made you instinctively check if there was a gas leak. Curious, he walked up to the house, hesitating at the door. It was slightly ajar. Now, that wasn't normal. Heather wasn't the kind of person to leave doors open. In fact, she had a whole speech about how crime rates are up and how Dennis had the worst situational awareness of any human being alive. Pushing it open, he stepped inside, immediately greeted by the smell of fresh paint. The whole living room had been redone. The walls, which had been a safe and boring beige that Dennis had never really had an opinion on, were now a deep, bold blue. A statement color, as Heather would probably call it. There was also new furniture. The old, comfortable couch, the one he had broken in to fit his exact shape, was gone, replaced with something sleek and modern. Even the rug was different. Heather? Dennis called out, still standing at the threshold like a guest in his own home. No answer. He walked further in, trying to process what exactly had happened here. This wasn't just a minor change. This was a full-blown redecoration. And while Dennis had made peace with the fact that his opinion on home decor didn't hold much weight in the household, he was pretty sure he would have at least been told about something this big. Then, his eyes landed on the bookshelf. Or, more accurately, what wasn't on the bookshelf. Dennis had never been much of a reader, but there were a few books that held sentimental value. A first-edition copy of The Catcher in the Rye his grandfather had given him, an old baseball almanac he had since high school, a couple of goofy conspiracy theory books he had picked up over the years. All gone. In their place? A collection of books he had never seen before. Books with pretentious titles like Awaken the Power Within and Mindful Living for the Modern Woman. It was at this exact moment that Dennis' brain registered what was happening. This wasn't their house anymore. This was her house. Dennis slowly backed up, as if he had accidentally wandered into someone else's home and was only now realizing it. His house, his marriage, had been completely renovated overnight. And the worst part? Heather hadn't even bothered to mention it. Just as Dennis was debating whether he should call his wife or just quietly file for a missing persons report on his own life, he heard a noise from upstairs. A voice. A male voice. Now, there were 2 ways to handle this situation. 1. March upstairs like a man in a dramatic movie scene, fling open the bedroom door, and prepare for a confrontation that would either end with a heartfelt speech or a very expensive divorce lawyer. 2. Pretend he didn't hear anything, go to the garage, and process the situation while staring blankly at his toolset. Dennis, being a man who valued his own sanity, chose option 2. He turned on his heel, walked out the front door, and headed straight to the garage. There, he sat on an old folding chair, hands clasped together like a man deep in thought. Now, was he jumping to conclusions? Maybe. Maybe Heather had simply developed a sudden passion for interior design. Maybe the voice upstairs belonged to a contractor, and they were just wrapping up some last-minute work. Or maybe Dennis was about 5 seconds away from becoming a character in one of those tragic country songs where the guy loses everything and ends up living in a trailer, drinking cheap beer, and writing sad poetry about his ex-wife. He sighed, rubbing his temples. Okay, Dennis, he muttered to himself. Think. Be rational. There has to be a reasonable explanation for all of this. And then, as if on cue, a loud crash echoed from upstairs, followed by a hurried shuffle of footsteps. Dennis exhaled slowly. Yeah. Rationality was overrated. Dennis had never considered himself the type of guy to sneak around his own house like a burglar, but here he was, standing in his garage, debating whether or not he should grab the old baseball bat from the corner before heading back inside. Not because he was scared, no, he was way past that, but because if there was ever a situation in which a man needed to assert some kind of presence, this was probably it. Then again, what was he supposed to do? March upstairs, swing open the door, and declare, "Explain yourself," like some dramatic courtroom drama? That was the kind of move that got people sent to anger management classes. Instead, he did what any mature, rational adult would do in this situation. He took his phone out, opened up a text message to Heather, and typed, "Hey. Who's upstairs?" It was a simple question. Direct. Straight to the point. The kind of question a husband should be able to ask his wife without feeling like he was about to uncover a crime scene. He hit send and waited. 3 seconds. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Nothing. That was odd. Heather was glued to her phone at all times. She responded to work emails faster than emergency dispatchers answered 911 calls. And yet, suddenly, silence. Dennis looked back toward the house. Now, there was a part of him, the part that still wanted to believe that his life wasn't currently unraveling, that told him maybe she was just in the bathroom. Maybe she had left her phone on the kitchen counter. Maybe there was a totally normal explanation for all of this, and he was just overreacting like some insecure sitcom husband. And then, as if the universe just couldn't resist messing with him further, another voice, this time much clearer, floated down from upstairs. It wasn't Heather's. It also wasn't the voice of someone discussing home improvement projects. Dennis had never believed in fate, but he was pretty sure that if the universe was trying to send him a message, this was it. Without giving himself a chance to overthink it, he walked back inside. The new paint on the walls still smelled fresh, like it had been done just hours ago. He took a deep breath, stepped forward, and then, in what could only be described as a pure act of stubborn defiance, yelled, "Heather! I'm home. And I'd love an explanation for why my house looks like a design catalog." Silence. Then, suddenly, hurried movement. Footsteps. Voices. The kind of frantic scrambling that only happens when people realize they've been caught doing something they shouldn't be doing. Dennis felt an odd sense of calm wash over him. This was it. The moment of truth. Heather appeared at the top of the stairs, looking like she had just run a marathon. Her face was flushed, her hair was a mess, and most importantly, she had that wide-eyed expression people got when they were trying to figure out how fast they could come up with a believable excuse. "Oh. Dennis. You're home early," she said, her voice just a little too high-pitched to be casual. Dennis folded his arms. "Yep. Shocking, isn't it?" Heather let out a weird little laugh. "I was just showing a friend the house. The new paint job. You like it?" Dennis tilted his head. "Oh, that's what's happening here. A house tour. For a friend. How considerate of you." The footsteps behind her stopped. Then, to Dennis' complete and utter lack of surprise, another figure hesitantly peeked out from behind the bedroom door. and that's when Dennis saw him. Some guy. Mid-40s. Sweating like a man who had just realized he made a terrible life choice. His shirt was wrinkled, and his entire demeanor screamed, "I was not expecting to be in this situation today." Dennis blinked. Then, in the most neutral tone he could muster, he said, "Well, that's a new face." Heather visibly tensed. "Dennis, this is..." Dennis held up a hand. "Nope. No introductions needed. I can already tell this is going to be one of those moments in life where the less I know, the better." The guy, who looked like he very much wanted to disappear into thin air, raised a hand awkwardly. Hi." Dennis stared at him. "Hi." More silence. Dennis turned back to Heather. "Okay, let's cut to the chase. Should I be giving him a guest room tour too, or are we skipping that part?" Heather looked like she wanted to spontaneously combust. "Dennis, please." Dennis sighed, shaking his head. "You know what? I actually don't need details. I really don't. I mean, I could ask a bunch of obvious questions, like why my bookshelf looks like it belongs to someone who hosts a wellness podcast, or why there's a random guy in my bedroom, but honestly, I think I already know the answers." Heather bit her lip. "It's not what it looks like." Dennis let out a sharp laugh. "Really? Because it looks exactly like what I think it looks like." The guy, who still hadn't moved from his spot like some kind of deer caught in the headlights, cleared his throat. I should probably go." Dennis gestured toward the door. "By all means. Don't let my house stop you." The man didn't need to be told twice. He practically sprinted past Dennis and out the front door, disappearing so fast that Dennis half expected to see a cartoon dust cloud left in his wake. Heather stood there, rubbing her temples. "Dennis, can we talk?" Dennis exhaled through his nose. "Oh, now you want to talk? Funny. Because I texted you earlier and got nothing. Not a single word. And yet, somehow, I still managed to find out exactly what was going on here." Heather opened her mouth, then closed it. Dennis nodded. "Yeah. That's what I thought." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Dennis clapped his hands together. "Well, that was an eventful homecoming. So, here's what's going to happen next. You're going to explain exactly what this whole thing is, and I'm going to sit here and decide whether or not I'm going to laugh, cry, or Google how much does it cost to legally erase a marriage from existence. Sound good?" Heather groaned, covering her face with her hands. "Dennis." Dennis pointed to the couch. "Nope. Start talking. I've got nothing but time." Dennis sat down on the couch, the new couch, the one he hadn't agreed to buy, the one that had replaced his couch, the one that had molded perfectly to his body after years of dedicated lounging. It was the kind of couch that screamed, "I am stylish and expensive but deeply uncomfortable." He shifted slightly. Yep. It was just as awful as he suspected. Heather, meanwhile, remained standing, arms crossed, shifting her weight from one foot to the other like a student called to the principal's office. Dennis gestured toward the other couch, the equally soulless, freshly acquired addition to his home. "You might as well sit. Unless you prefer standing while explaining, whatever this is." Heather hesitated, then reluctantly sat down, pressing her lips together like she was still mentally drafting her opening statement. Dennis clapped his hands together. "All right. Let's hear it. And please, spare me the 'it's not what it looks like' speech, because I'm not in the mood for an optical illusion lesson." Heather exhaled. "Dennis, Dennis held up a finger. "Wait. Before you start, let me ask something. How long have I been a fool?" Heather blinked. "What?" Dennis leaned back, arms stretched across the top of the couch. "You heard me. How long have I been walking around like a fool, completely oblivious to the fact that my wife was doing whatever this is? Because, let's be honest, this didn't just start yesterday." Heather winced. It's not like that. Dennis pointed to the door. A guy just sprinted out of my house like I was about to chase him with a pitchfork. So, forgive me if I have some doubts about your version of what it's like. Heather closed her eyes for a second, then opened them. Fine. If you want the truth, here it is. Dennis made an exaggerated go-on gesture. Heather took a deep breath. I needed a change. Dennis blinked. A change. Yes. Dennis scratched his chin. And naturally, when people need a change, they think, hey, you know what would really shake things up? Secretly replacing my husband's entire home while hanging out with another guy. Heather groaned. That's not. Dennis held up a hand. Let me guess. You were just talking? Heather hesitated. Dennis laughed. Oh, this is fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. So, just to clarify, you hired an entire moving crew, picked out furniture that looks like it belongs in an overpriced coffee shop, and decided to host your own personal men-dropping-by uninvited event, but I'm supposed to believe it was all part of some innocent lifestyle adjustment? Heather sighed. I didn't think it would get to this point. Dennis grinned. Oh, so this isn't what you planned? What was the original idea? A casual home invasion? Maybe throw in a few surprise guests? Heather threw her hands up. Dennis, can you stop being sarcastic for 5 seconds? Dennis tapped his chin. Let me think about that. He pretended to ponder for a moment, then shook his head. Nope. I really can't. Heather rubbed her temples. Okay. I get it. You're mad. Dennis nodded. Correct. A+. You finally understand basic human emotions. Heather huffed. Can we just talk like adults? Dennis spread his arms. By all means. Go ahead. Give me the mature explanation for why another man was hiding upstairs like he accidentally wandered into the wrong sitcom. Heather looked away. Dennis smirked. Yeah. That's what I thought. The silence stretched. Dennis let out a slow breath, tapping his fingers on the couch. Here's the thing, Heather. I could sit here and listen to whatever excuse you're about to pull out of your self-improvement book collection, or I can just state the obvious. You've been doing something you shouldn't have been doing, and you assumed I'd be too oblivious to notice. Heather swallowed. Dennis continued. And to be fair, you were right for a while. I didn't notice. Not because I'm fool, but because, brace yourself, I actually trusted you. Wild concept, huh? Heather's eyes flickered with something that looked like guilt, but Dennis wasn't about to give her points for suddenly remembering how emotions worked. He leaned forward. So, let's cut to the chase. When did this start? And don't give me some vague, it just happened nonsense. Actual numbers, please. Heather stared at the floor. A few months. Dennis nodded slowly. A few months. Fascinating. And when, exactly, were you planning on telling me? Or was this just going to be one of those if he doesn't ask, it doesn't count situations? Heather let out a shaky breath. I didn't know how to bring it up. Dennis laughed. Oh, well, that's understandable. I mean, really, how does one casually mention that they've been spending a few months being someone else's home tour guide? Heather buried her face in her hands. I messed up. Dennis clapped his hands. Once again, correct. 2 for 2. You're on a roll. Heather glared at him. You don't have to be a jerk about it. Dennis tilted his head. Interesting choice of words, considering the situation. More silence. Dennis stood up, stretching. All right. I think I've heard enough. Heather's eyes widened. That's it? Dennis shrugged. What else is there to say? You did what you did. I found out in the most ridiculous way possible. Now, we move on to the part where I decide how much of my sanity I'm willing to keep. Heather stood too. So, what does that mean? Dennis sighed. It means, Heather, that I need a moment to process the fact that my entire day has gone from normal to oh, look, my wife has rebranded our home into her personal dating lounge. Heather groaned. Can you be serious for 1 second? Dennis pointed at the couch. I am serious. Seriously uncomfortable. This couch sucks. Heather pressed her fingers to her temples again. Dennis grabbed his keys. I'm going for a drive. Heather stiffened. Where? Dennis raised an eyebrow. Oh, now you're interested in my whereabouts? That's rich. Heather's mouth opened, then shut. Dennis headed to the door. See you later, roommate. And with that, he walked out, leaving Heather standing there, looking exactly how she should, like someone who had finally realized just how badly she had screwed up. Dennis wasn't the kind of guy who needed much time to process things. He liked facts. He liked conclusions. He liked when things made sense. Unfortunately, his marriage had now entered the category of things that do not make sense and probably never did. And that was annoying. More annoying than the time Heather convinced him to switch to organic toothpaste that tasted like wet chalk. More annoying than when she filled the fridge with almond milk even though neither of them had an allergy or a reason to pretend they were better than regular milk. More annoying than when she accidentally deleted all his saved shows on the DVR because who even watches those old episodes anymore, Dennis? All of that, he could live with. But this? The guy in the bedroom, the new furniture, the months of deception? That was a little harder to swallow. He had no real plan for what came next. Heather had done a pretty thorough job of turning his home into her home, so going back there and pretending everything was fine wasn't an option. But he wasn't about to run off and do something melodramatic either. Instead, he did what any man in his situation would do. He drove to the only place where life still made sense. The hardware store. The bright fluorescent lights. The smell of sawdust. The unnecessarily wide selection of power drills. This was a place of logic, where people made real decisions. Practical decisions. Decisions like, do I need a new screwdriver set? And should I finally get that socket wrench organizer I've been meaning to buy for 3 years? It was peaceful. It was predictable. It was everything his marriage currently wasn't. He wandered the aisles for a while, just existing in the presence of things that weren't lying to him. Nobody had ever walked into a hardware store and been betrayed by a hammer. Hammers didn't make secret plans behind your back. Hammers didn't suddenly wake up one day and decide they needed a change. Dennis exhaled, rubbing his temples. And that's when a voice snapped him out of his thoughts. Well, if it isn't the most committed non-handyman I've ever met. Dennis turned. And there, standing next to a display of extension cords, was Patrick. Patrick wasn't technically his best friend, but considering the fact that Dennis had known him for over a decade, worked with him for 5 years, and still somehow tolerated his presence, the title was as close as anyone was going to get. Dennis nodded. Patrick. Patrick smirked. Didn't take you for a Tuesday evening hardware store kind of guy. Dennis shrugged. Didn't take my wife for a married but hosting another man in my bedroom kind of woman, but here we are. Patrick stared. What? Dennis grabbed a random pack of screws off the shelf. He didn't need them, but it gave him something to do with his hands. Heather. She's been, doing things. Patrick raised an eyebrow. Elaborate. Dennis sighed. Let's just say my home has had some unexpected renovations. And also, there was a guy upstairs. Patrick whistled. Yikes. That's rough, man. Dennis tossed the screws back onto the shelf. Yeah. Tell me about it. Patrick crossed his arms. So, what's the plan? You gonna set all her plants on fire? Dennis gave him a look. Patrick. Come on. Patrick held up his hands. Fine. No arson. But seriously, what now? Dennis exhaled. I have no idea. Patrick studied him for a second, then nodded. All right. You hungry? Dennis hesitated. Patrick pointed a finger at him. I know you haven't eaten. You're too busy standing in the middle of a hardware store like a guy who just found out his house doesn't belong to him anymore. So, we're getting food. No arguments. Dennis grunted. Fine. Patrick patted him on the shoulder. There we go. Now, come on. Let's go eat something completely unhealthy and pretend life isn't a disaster. And for the first time that evening, Dennis actually cracked a small smile. Maybe, just maybe, he'd survive this mess after all. Dennis was beginning to suspect that Patrick had been looking for an excuse to drag him somewhere, because the moment he agreed to get food, the man practically shoved him into the passenger seat of his car like this was some kind of emergency intervention. You're gonna need a distraction, Patrick announced, pulling out of the parking lot like he was on a mission. Dennis sighed. You act like I just lost my entire family in a freak accident. I caught my wife with another guy. That's not exactly breaking news in the grand scheme of human history. Patrick grinned. True. But it is breaking news in that Dennis's life is actually interesting for once section. Dennis rolled his eyes. Glad to see you're enjoying this. Oh, I love it, Patrick said. I mean, don't get me wrong, I feel bad for you, but I also feel like this is an important character building moment. Like a turning point in a really good TV show. Dennis scoffed. Oh yeah? And what kind of character am I supposed to be? Patrick drummed his fingers on the wheel. Well, right now, you're the guy who gets cheated on and looks confused in a hardware store, which isn't great, but there's still time for a redemption arc. Dennis sighed. Fantastic. Can't wait. They drove in silence for a few minutes before Dennis finally asked, So where are we going? Patrick smirked. Somewhere fun. Dennis immediately regretted getting into the car. 10 minutes later, they pulled into a parking lot, and Dennis realized exactly what kind of fun Patrick had in mind. A bowling alley. Of all places. Dennis stared at the glowing neon sign above the entrance. Seriously? Patrick grinned. What? You need a way to blow off steam, and I need an opportunity to crush your spirit in an environment where my athletic ability actually matters. Dennis exhaled. Fine. But if I see one birthday party full of screaming kids, I'm leaving. Patrick clapped a hand on his shoulder. Deal. They walked inside, the smell of cheap carpet cleaner and worn-out bowling shoes hitting them instantly. Patrick got them a lane, ordered a round of whatever beer the place was serving, and the two of them settled into the uncomfortable plastic chairs. Dennis looked around. The place was exactly what you'd expect. A mix of bored teenagers, dads trying too hard to be competitive, and groups of people who looked like they hadn't picked up a bowling ball in a decade but still wanted to act like professionals. Patrick stretched his arms. All right, Dennis. Time to let out all that pent-up frustration in a way that doesn't involve property damage. Dennis sighed, picking up a ball. Yeah. He lined up his shot, took a deep breath, and rolled the ball down the lane. It went straight into the gutter. Patrick burst out laughing. Wow. That was actually worse than I expected. Dennis turned to him. You're supposed to be supportive. Patrick wiped a fake tear from his eye. Oh, I am. I'm supporting your ability to make me feel better about my own bowling skills. Dennis sat down, crossing his arms. Whatever. Your turn. Patrick grabbed a ball, strutted up to the lane like he was about to do something incredible, and rolled it straight into a split. He turned back around, nodding. See? That's how you fail with style. Dennis couldn't help but laugh. Unbelievable. Patrick sat down beside him, cracking open his beer. All right, let's get serious for a second. What's the actual plan here? With Heather, I mean. Dennis exhaled. I don't know, man. What do you even do in this situation? Sue her for emotional damages? Demand reimbursement for the couch I never agreed to replace? Patrick took a sip of his drink. I mean, you could do that, but let's be real. You gotta decide if you're gonna stay married to someone who made that kind of choice. Dennis stared down at his beer. Yeah. Patrick tilted his head. Do you even want to fix things? Dennis hesitated. That was the real question, wasn't it? Because, logically, he should want to fix things. He and Heather had been together for years. Marriage was supposed to be about working through problems. But there was a very real part of him that just didn't see the point. Heather had already made decisions for him without him. She had changed their home, changed the rules, and had expected him to just adapt. So why should he be the one to fight for something she clearly didn't care about? Patrick nudged his arm. You know, you could do something crazy. Dennis raised an eyebrow. Like what? Patrick smirked. Like not doing what everyone expects. Maybe, instead of having a dramatic argument, or begging for an explanation you don't even need, you just move on. Let her deal with the fallout of her choices. Dennis blinked. Just like that? Patrick shrugged. I mean, think about it. She's probably expecting a big fight, right? A whole mess of emotions, maybe even a long, drawn-out period where you work on things. But what if you just don't give her that satisfaction? What if you just decide she's not worth the effort? Dennis was quiet for a moment. Because, really, what was the point of all this? If Heather had wanted to fix things, she wouldn't have done what she did in the first place. So why should he be the one scrambling to make sense of everything? Patrick leaned back in his chair. I bet if you just walked away from the whole thing, she'd lose her mind. She's expecting drama. She's expecting guilt. But you don't owe her either. Dennis thought about that. And, for the first time since the whole mess started, he actually felt a sense of control. Patrick grinned. So, what do you say? You ready to win at something tonight? Dennis smirked, grabbing his ball. Let's find out. And this time, when he rolled, he hit a strike. Dennis woke up the next morning to the sound of his phone buzzing aggressively on the nightstand. For a brief, blissful moment, he forgot everything. Then reality settled back in like an unwanted guest, reminding him that his wife had turned their home into a showroom for her double life. He glanced at the screen. Heather. Of course. The logical part of him knew he should answer. That's what responsible adults did, right? They communicated. But Dennis wasn't feeling particularly responsible today. Instead, he let the call ring out, watching as Heather's name disappeared, only to be immediately replaced by a text notification. Heather, we need to talk. Please come home. Dennis rubbed his face. Ah, there it was. The classic let's talk message. He could already predict how this would go. She'd sit him down, try to look remorseful, throw in a few carefully crafted excuses, and then expect him to be mature and work through it together. The thing was, Dennis had spent years being mature in this marriage. He had compromised. He had adjusted. He had listened to every book recommendation, sat through every conversation about how they should be growing together, and nodded along to every unnecessary change Heather decided to make. And for what? So she could replace their couch and invite some guy over like Dennis was nothing more than a tenant in his own life? Yeah. No thanks. Patrick's words from the night before rang in his head. What if you just decide she's not worth the effort? Dennis took a deep breath, stood up, and did something he should have done a long time ago. He packed. Nothing dramatic, just the essentials. A few changes of clothes, his laptop, the important documents that he had actually organized, because, despite Heather's love for decluttering, she had the worst filing system imaginable. He grabbed his work bag, his sneakers, and after a brief moment of thought, his coffee maker. Because if Heather got to keep the house, she wasn't getting the good coffee, too. It was shockingly easy. Maybe because, deep down, he had already been checked out of this marriage for longer than he realized. As he zipped up the bag, his phone buzzed again. Heather, Dennis, please. Dennis exhaled. Okay. Fine. He'd give her one conversation. Not for her, but for himself. To see if there was even a sliver of doubt left. When he pulled into the driveway, everything looked the same, which was almost funny. His entire world had flipped, and yet here was their house, sitting there like nothing had changed. Heather was waiting at the door, arms crossed, looking like someone who had spent the entire night practicing what to say. Dennis stepped inside, noting that, surprise, the house still smelled like fresh paint. A constant reminder that this wasn't his home anymore. Heather cleared her throat. Dennis held up a hand. Before you start, let's make this simple. Are you about to tell me the truth, or are you going to try and make this sound like some misunderstanding? Heather flinched. Dennis. Because if it's the second one, we can just skip this whole thing, Dennis said, dropping his bag by the door. I don't have the patience for a speech about how complicated everything is. Heather inhaled sharply. I never meant to hurt you. Dennis laughed. Wow. Straight out of the Cheating for Beginners handbook. That's almost worse than saying nothing at all. Heather clenched her jaw. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Dennis crossed his arms. You know, I keep hearing that, but I have yet to hear what was supposed to happen. Were you easing me into the idea that I don't actually live here anymore? Was the guy upstairs just a practice round before you decided to let me know I'd been downgraded from husband to occasional visitor? Heather groaned. Why do you have to make everything a joke? Because if I don't laugh, I might actually process the fact that my wife threw away our marriage like it was an outdated couch. Oh, wait. She did do that. Heather's face twisted. Dennis, I never planned for any of this. Dennis rubbed his temples. That's the thing, Heather. I believe you. I really do. Because planning would require thinking about someone other than yourself, and clearly, that hasn't been your strong suit lately. Heather exhaled. I needed something different. Dennis nodded. Yeah. I got that part. Loud and clear. Heather stared at him. Does that mean? Dennis tilted his head. What? That I'm just gonna stay here and pretend this never happened? That we work through this? Heather swallowed. I was hoping. Dennis laughed again, shaking his head. Of course you were. Heather took a step closer. Dennis, I love you. That hasn't changed. Dennis raised an eyebrow. Hasn't changed? Heather, everything has changed. The only thing that hasn't changed is you expecting me to just go along with whatever you decide is best for both of us. Heather's expression wavered. So what? You're just done? Dennis picked up his bag, slinging it over his shoulder. Yeah. I think I am. Heather's mouth opened, but no words came out. Dennis turned toward the door, pausing just long enough to glance back. You know, you probably expected some big dramatic fight. Maybe a long, painful back and forth where I beg you to choose me, or we try to patch things up for the sake of history or whatever people call it. But honestly? Heather just stared at him. Dennis smirked. I don't think I care enough to try. And with that, he walked out. No shouting. No final, desperate pleas. Just a man finally deciding that he got to choose what happened next. And for the first time in a long time, Dennis felt like he was actually living his own life. Thanks for watching. Please hit the like button and rate the story in the comments.